"Brace for impact!" Captain Darius Halverson shouted, his voice sharp and commanding as the sudden lurch of the Aurelia Hope threw everyone to the side. The alarm screamed through the ship, a relentless shriek that clawed at their nerves. The lights flickered once, twice, then plunged into darkness. Only the eerie glow of laser plasma displays illuminated the command center, casting harsh blue glows on their faces, momentarily making them look like ghosts in a forgotten war. The ship was no longer gliding through the calm expanse of deep space. It was shaking violently under the assault. Halverson gripped the console, his knuckles white, and shouted again, "Full power to forward shields! Get those engines online, now!" His voice never wavered, even though the pounding of his pulse throbbed in his temples. The ship felt alive with pain. The hull groaned as though it too was trying to survive. Lieutenant Kalen Thorne, his tactical officer, was already at his post, fingers flying over the heads-up display. "Shields are at 30%, Captain. We're sitting ducks out here." Captain Halverson didn't respond immediately. His eyes swept over the battle map on the display, pinpoints of light moving in unison with the chaotic thrum of the battle. There were too many of them. Far too many. The Xrithar Legion had arrived with a vengeance. Silent, calculated, and lethal, their fleet was descending on the Aurelia Hope like a pack of wolves to an injured prey. A violent tremor rattled the ship again, and Halverson's grip tightened on the console. "They're trying to cripple our engines." His words were cold, full of the realization that this wasn't just an attack. It was an ambush, designed to take them down before they even had a chance to respond. His thoughts flashed briefly to their mission. Transporting wounded diplomats from the Kaltoran alliance, key players in fragile peace talks. Now it was no longer just a medical mission. It was a race for survival. The intercom buzzed, and the voice of Dr. Ezekiel Barrow, the ship's chief medical officer, crackled through, sounding strained but firm. "Captain, we have casualties in the medical bay. The wards are overwhelmed. We need you to make a call on whether to evacuate." "I don't care about evacuation right now," Halverson barked, his teeth clenched. "If we don't hold them off, there won't be any evacuees left to save. Get the patients secured." Thorne gave him a glance, a quick, sharp look, but Halverson could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. Was there enough time? For a moment, the air between them was thick, filled with the unspoken dread of what might come next. Then, without another word, Thorne turned back to his display, barking orders into the comms. Outside the bridge, the distant echoes of alien blasts vibrated through the steel walls, the impact rattling their bones. The staccato rhythm of fire seemed endless, battering against the ship's shields with a relentless fury. Halverson was already standing up, eyes fixed on the heads-up display. He needed a solution. There had to be one. Humanity had survived so much, had fought tooth and nail to secure even a scrap of peace in this galaxy. They weren't going to lose it now. The air in the command center felt thick, suffocating. The stench of burned ozone and melting metal drifted into his nostrils, gritty and metallic, as if the very air was warning them of their doom. But Halverson didn't flinch. He didn't have time to hesitate. "Lieutenant, patch me through to the engine room," he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding again. "Captain," Thorne began, pausing, "the Hope is losing power. If we don't get auxiliary systems online—" "I know," Halverson cut him off, his gaze never wavering. "Do it anyway. This ship has more fight in it than any of us know. We just need to reach into those old Earth resources." There was a beat of silence before Thorne responded. "Understood, Captain." Thorne wasn't just a tactical officer. He was a soldier, a survivor. His voice carried that weight, the unspoken resolve of a man who had seen humanity on the brink before. Now they were fighting again, fighting for the very soul of Earth's future in this cold, uncaring galaxy. "All hands, brace for another hit," Halverson shouted, feeling the ship shudder beneath him as another wave of alien fire struck the weakened shields. The emergency lights flickered violently, casting strange, jittery shadows across the bridge. He turned to his crew, their faces a blend of determination and fear. It was impossible to ignore the reality of the situation now. Xrithar Legion ships were closing in, and their heavily armed warships were designed to obliterate. The Aurelia Hope, a hospital ship, had no business being here, and they knew it. They weren't supposed to be fighting, only helping. The irony was biting, but there was no escaping it now. "Captain," Thorn interrupted his thoughts, "we've got incoming missile lock from their lead cruiser. They'll hit us before we can even move." Halverson's mind raced. Earth had always been outgunned, outnumbered, and underestimated. But they had survived countless battles because they weren't just soldiers, they were survivors. And it wasn't just about brute strength. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't its firepower. It was adaptability. It was their ability to think under pressure, to outsmart their enemies when everything seemed lost. "Lieutenant, get me everything from Earth's legacy, the old systems, the ones we haven't even touched since the war," Halverson ordered, his tone calm yet intense. "We're not going down without a fight." Thorn's eyes met Halverson's, understanding in that shared look. Earth's old war tech, relics of the First Contact War, were buried deep within the ship's vaults. Old railguns, barely functional EMP devices, and systems that hadn't seen use in decades. They were humanity's last hope. "Right away, Captain," Thorn said, his voice steady, despite the chaos around them. Halverson turned back to his crew, heart pounding. His eyes met Lieutenant Kalen Thorn's, and for a moment, everything was still. The fate of the ship, of the diplomats, of Earth's diplomatic future, it all hinged on this one moment. Could they pull off a miracle, or would this be the end? And then, another voice, a voice full of fear and hesitation, crackled through the comms. "We've got patients in critical condition, Captain." Dr. Barrow's voice trembled. "We fight for them," Halverson shouted, his voice carrying every ounce of desperation and determination. "We fight for humanity's future." He had no choice now. The Xrithar Legion was relentless. But humanity never backed down. The Aurelia Hope groaned, a violent shudder rattling the walls as another explosion rocked the ship. The forward shields flickered, barely holding. Captain Darius Halverson gritted his teeth and slammed his hand against the command console. Every second felt like an eternity. On the laser plasma display, the Xrithar ships continued to close in, their forms like dark shadows in a storm, intent on devouring the ship whole. The sound of metal groaning, the sharp crack of impact, echoed through the corridors, vibrating through his teeth. "Another hit to the starboard side," Thorn shouted, his voice edged with urgency. His fingers danced over the heads-up display, pulling up critical systems reports. The ship's hull was weakening. Power failures rippled through the systems, one after another. "Status on medical?" Halverson barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Dr. Barrow's team is doing what they can," Thorn replied, still focused on the screen. "But we've got civilians on board. Some of them aren't going to make it if we don't get out of here." Halverson's chest tightened. The diplomats, the very reason they were out here, were now casualties of war. He glanced to the side where the faces of the crew were illuminated by the harsh light of the laser plasma displays. Fear, desperation, and resolve marked their features. No one had signed up for this, but now it was their duty to carry on. His thoughts shifted to Ambassador Torin Jarek and the other diplomats locked in the medical bay. He couldn't afford to lose them. Not just for their lives, but for the fragile peace humanity was trying to maintain in a galaxy teeming with hostile forces. The weight of their mission pressed on him like 100 tons of metal. Thorn's voice snapped him back. "Captain, the Xrithar are pressing hard. We can't keep this up. We need a strategy, and we need it fast." Halverson took a deep breath, his mind racing. His eyes flickered to the heads-up display, where enemy ships loomed large, their weapons primed. There was no escaping their range, not without something more, something that would turn the tide. "Divert all available power to the aft shields," Halverson ordered. "We need to buy time. Get those auxiliary systems working, now." Thorn gave him a sharp nod, but his eyes betrayed a hint of doubt. "If we do that, the forward shields will collapse. We won't last long if they push again." "We're not trying to last, Lieutenant," Halverson snapped. "We're trying to survive long enough for a counterattack." Thorn didn't argue. He was right. Their options were dwindling by the second. The Aurelia Hope was built for peace, for healing, not war. The irony gnawed at Halverson. He had never imagined this kind of fight, but here they were, fighting not just for their lives, but for humanity's place in the galaxy. "How long can you hold them off?" Halverson turned to Commander Ren Voss, who had been quietly scanning the space around them. His hands were steady, his expression unreadable, but the weariness in his eyes was unmistakable. "Not long," Voss replied. "These ships are too well equipped, and they're closing in from all sides. We're outgunned and outmanned. Our best bet is to fight smart, not hard." "Fight smart," Halverson repeated. "We're not outgunned yet. We just need to make them think we are." The ship shuddered again. The sound of rending metal sent a jolt of adrenaline through Halverson's body. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, but he couldn't afford to falter. Not now. Not ever. "Barrow to Halverson," came the voice over the comm. The tone was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had seen too many crises. "Captain, I have critical patients down here. I need to know if we're abandoning the ship or—" "We're not abandoning anyone," Halverson said, his voice firm. "We fight to the last. Secure the diplomats. Do what you need to do. Just keep them alive until we make it through this." He could hear the resigned sigh on the other end. Barrow had been through hell, but his resolve had never broken. That's why Halverson trusted him. "Understood," Barrow responded, though his voice was thinner this time. He was doing everything he could. But this wasn't just a medical emergency anymore. It was a war. As Halverson moved to the heads-up display, he could feel the pull of gravity shift beneath his feet. The deck tilted violently, sending a few of the crew stumbling. They were taking on more damage than they could repair. But Halverson refused to let the panic creep in. Not while there was still a chance. "Activate the old railguns," he commanded. "We're going to send them a message they won't forget." Voss looked at him, eyes narrowed. "The railguns? Are you out of your mind? Those haven't been used in—" "They're our only option, Commander," Halverson said, cutting him off. "We can't run. We can't hide. We hit them hard enough to make them think twice. Now bring them online." There was no hesitation this time. Voss moved swiftly, flipping switches and inputting commands into the console. Old Earth technology hummed to life with a violent crack, shaking the hull and firing a burst of high-velocity kinetic energy toward the approaching enemy ships. The result was immediate. A Xrithar ship, one of their lead cruisers, was hit square in the side. The blast rocked the vessel, sending it veering off course. The crew on the bridge held their breath. It wasn't enough to cripple the cruiser, but it was enough to make the enemy pause to wonder if they had underestimated humanity's resolve. "Well, that got their attention," Thorne muttered, his voice laced with grim satisfaction. But Halverson wasn't ready to celebrate. "This fight is far from over." As he turned to look at the view outside, the eerie glow of deep space contrasted sharply with the incoming storm. Xrithar ships loomed in the distance, but there was a new glimmer of hope. Humanity had just shown the first crack in the enemy's armor. For a moment, Halverson allowed himself a fleeting thought of victory, but it quickly vanished as another blast hit the starboard side. The sound of fire and chaos echoed through the corridors. The crew was still fighting. The diplomats were still alive, for now. But the Xrithar were relentless, and Halverson knew the worst was yet to come. "All hands, prepare for another round," he commanded, his voice cold and focused. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The Aurelia Hope was battered, but humanity's spirit was far from broken, and Halverson wasn't going down without making the Xrithar regret their decision. The ship was alive with chaos. Another wave of impact, violent, sudden, shuddered through the Aurelia Hope, and the metallic screech of straining steel rattled the crew to their bones. Captain Darius Halverson gripped the edge of the command chair, his fingers digging into the cold surface as the bridge trembled under the Xrithar's relentless barrage. Through the laser plasma display, enemy ships continued their cold, calculating assault. The brightness of their incoming fire was sharp against the blackness of space, making the bridge feel like a cockpit of a doomed fighter ship. The pulse of their weapons reverberated through the deck as though the ship itself was gasping for air. Thorne's voice cut through the noise, steady but laced with urgency. "Captain, shields are almost gone. We need more time to get those auxiliary systems online, if they don't cut through us first." Halverson's eyes flickered toward the heads-up display, where the graphic of their dwindling shields flashed red, warning of imminent failure. Behind him, there was the constant background hiss of wires sparking, the acrid scent of burning insulation in the air. The ship's infrastructure was crumbling, a slow, inevitable death. Yet Halverson didn't let himself think about the slow burn of failure. He couldn't. Not when lives hung in the balance. Not when the future of Earth's diplomatic efforts was on the line. "Get us something to fight back with. Anything," Halverson muttered, half to himself. He had no illusions left. This was no longer about just surviving. It was about sending a message. Humanity had fought, had bled to make it this far. They were not going to be erased in a moment of cosmic indifference. Thorn didn't hesitate. "Captain, if we can fire the railguns, we might buy ourselves enough time to stabilize." "Do it," Halverson ordered, eyes narrowing with a surge of cold resolve. He could feel the weight of the moment, but there was no room for hesitation. Every second counted now. The railguns, ancient relics from the First Contact War, had been stored in the deepest, most secure compartments of the ship, untouched for decades. No one had ever expected them to be needed. No one except Halverson. The low rumble of ancient machinery coming to life filled the air. The hum of the railguns sparked a primitive thrill in Halverson's chest. Earth's forgotten legacy, buried under the weight of years, was suddenly their best hope for survival. The low metallic groan of the weapon systems firing vibrated through the walls of the bridge as the first round tore into the dark expanse of space, a flash of blinding light ripping through the enemy cruiser. The ship jolted forward with the impact, and for a moment there was silence. The Xrithar cruiser shuddered violently, its shields weakening as the projectile collided with its hull, a spray of fragmented debris exploding into space. But the silence was brief. Halverson knew the strike had been symbolic, more than a decisive blow. They had angered the beast. "That's one ship down," Thorn muttered, but his eyes were already shifting to the next problem. "We've got more incoming, and they're smarter than we thought." "That was never meant to stop them," Halverson said, his voice low but edged with determination. "It was a warning. Let them think we're down. Let them underestimate us. Then we'll hit them where it hurts." The crew worked quickly, their motions synchronized, but each flicker of the laser plasma displays and each low beep from the diagnostic panels underscored just how fragile their situation was. "Captain," came Commander Voss's calm voice from the tactical station, "we've got a breach in the port side. It's worse than we anticipated. Life support is going offline. We need to seal off the outer hull, or we lose the entire section." Halverson's jaw tightened, but he remained unflinching. There was no room for panic. "Voss, get those doors closed now. Seal every section you can. Thorn, is there anything left in the old systems that we can use to fight back?" For a moment Thorn paused, the fingers that had been working the controls slowing, uncertainty flickering across his face. The ship's old systems had been reliable once, but time had eroded their functionality. Still, he was the only one who could work with the ancient machinery. "There's something," Thorn said, his voice steadying with each word. "I can reroute the backup systems to boost our defense grid, but it's a gamble. No telling if they'll hold." "I'll take that gamble," Halverson said. "Just make it work." Thorn nodded, moving quickly to the side panel, inputting commands. The urgency in the air thickened as the crew continued to operate at full speed, despite the chaos unfolding around them. Halverson's mind was still racing, running scenarios, analyzing each move in 1,000 possible ways. Every minute they spent alive was a victory, but how much longer could they hold out? "Captain," Lieutenant Renvoss said, his voice gravelly, "the Xrithar are coordinating. They've adjusted. They know we're vulnerable. They're coming for the medical bay next." Halverson's heart skipped a beat. The diplomats, Ambassador Torin Jarek and the others, were still in the medical bay, vulnerable, exposed. If the Xrithar hit that section next, he shook his head, forcing the thought away. "Thorn, can you isolate the medical bay? Lock it down. Secure those patients. We'll protect them from this end." Already on it, Thorn replied, his fingers a blur over the display. Halverson took a deep breath, stepping back from the console and glancing at the crew around him. His crew. They were human, damaged, tired, and running out of time. But they had something the Xrithar didn't. They had the ability to adapt. He took a step forward. Listen up. They want to wipe us out. They want to break us. But we're not just a ship. We're humanity's last line. And that means we're going to make them pay for every second they think they've won. He let the words hang in the air, the weight of them grounding every member of the crew to the reality of their fight. As Halverson turned back to the console, his mind still reeling from the initial impact of the attack, a strange calm washed over him. There was no choice but to win. If they didn't, humanity's fragile hold on this part of the galaxy would slip away. The battle wasn't just for the Aurelia Hope. It was for everything they had fought for, everything they stood for. The low hiss of the laser plasma displays intensified as Thorn initiated another series of commands. The ship groaned once more, as though responding to the change in direction. The railguns powered up again, crackling with raw potential. The Xrithar might have underestimated humanity in the past, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. Thorn turned back, eyes flicking with urgency. Captain, they're regrouping. The next wave will be worse. I'm prepping the EMP pulse, but we need more time. We'll buy you that time, Halverson said. Hold them off until then. We're not finished yet. As the ship lurched once more, the distant thundering sound of alien weaponry grew louder, a constant reminder of their mortality. Yet amid the chaos, Halverson knew this. Humanity would never go down without a fight, and the Xrithar would come to regret the day they'd underestimated Earth's hidden strength. The Aurelia Hope jerked again, the deck shuddering as another blast tore through its hull. The laser plasma displays blinked in warning, their bright lights casting sharp, jagged shadows across the bridge. Captain Darius Halverson gripped the edge of his console, his knuckles turning white. The ship groaned, a deep mechanical moan that reverberated through his bones. The shields were practically gone, the ship vulnerable, but it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. Captain, they're closing in, Lieutenant Kalen Thorn said, his voice a mixture of calm and resolve. We've got one last shot. Railguns are recharged. We need to make it count. Halverson glanced at the heads-up display, where Xrithar ships loomed large, their weapons glowing like hungry beasts ready to devour them. They had underestimated humanity's ability to fight back, but now, Halverson realized, it was time to make them regret it. The Xrithar might have had the advantage in numbers, but humanity had something else. Their ability to adapt, to use the scraps and remnants of Earth's past to fight a war no one had prepared for. Hit them with everything you've got, Halverson said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. Then prepare the EMP pulse. We need to disrupt their systems. Thorn gave a sharp nod, fingers dancing over the console, tapping out commands. The low rumble of the railguns came to life once again, their ancient mechanisms creaking to life with a startling ferocity. Halverson felt his pulse quicken. Earth's technology, old and forgotten, was their last line of defense. Firing in 3, 2... Thorn's voice was tight. The countdown stretched in Halverson's mind as the air in the bridge seemed to thicken, the weight of impending destruction pressing down on him. 1. The shot rang out, a burst of blinding light that ripped through the empty void, slamming into one of the Xrithar warships. The impact shook the ship, a violent explosion that sent a shockwave rippling through the surrounding space. Halverson's ears rang, the echoes of the blast vibrating deep in his chest. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Thorn's voice broke through the haze. We've got their attention. They're regrouping. Halverson's eyes narrowed as he saw the Xrithar ships shifting, their maneuvers growing tighter, their formation more coordinated. They were no longer attacking blindly. They were adapting. The realization hit him hard. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. EMP pulse ready, Captain, Thorn said. If we fire, it'll knock out their shields, but we only have one shot. Halverson stood still for a moment, the weight of their situation hanging heavily in the air. The sound of battle, the clashing of energy blasts, the sharp screech of impacted metal felt like the very heartbeat of the ship. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Halverson felt something else beneath the tension, something deeper. Earth's ingenuity had always been a silent weapon in the face of superior technology. They had been underestimated before, and now they had a chance to prove that Earth's true strength wasn't just in its might, but in its will to survive. "Fire the pulse," Halverson ordered, his voice unwavering. Thorn's hands flew across the display, sending the EMP pulse surging into the cold void of space. The instant it fired, a pulse of blue light exploded from the ship, sending a ripple through the surrounding area. The enemy ships staggered. For a brief moment, Halverson saw their shields flicker and then fail. The Xrithar's tactical systems began to glitch, their movements becoming erratic. The Aurelia Hope jerked again, the deck shuddering as another blast tore through its hull. The laser plasma displays blinked in warning, their bright lights casting sharp, jagged shadows across the bridge. Captain Darius Halverson gripped the edge of his console, his knuckles turning white. The ship groaned, a deep mechanical moan that reverberated through his bones. The shields were practically gone, the ship vulnerable, but it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. "Captain, they're closing in," Lieutenant Kalen Thorne said, his voice a mixture of calm and resolve. "We've got one last shot. Railguns are recharged. We need to make it count." Halverson glanced at the heads-up display, where Xrithar ships loomed large, their weapons glowing like hungry beasts ready to devour them. They had underestimated humanity's ability to fight back, but now, Halverson realized, it was time to make them regret it. The Xrithar might have had the advantage in numbers, but humanity had something else. Their ability to adapt, to use the scraps and remnants of Earth's past to fight a war no one had prepared for. "Hit them with everything you've got," Halverson said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "Then prepare the EMP pulse. We need to disrupt their systems." Thorne gave a sharp nod, fingers dancing over the console, tapping out commands. The low rumble of the railguns came to life once again, their ancient mechanisms creaking to life with a startling ferocity. Halverson felt his pulse quicken. Earth's technology, old and forgotten, was their last line of defense. "Firing in 3, 2... Thorne's voice was tight. The countdown stretched in Halverson's mind as the air in the bridge seemed to thicken, the weight of impending destruction pressing down on him. 1. The shot rang out, a burst of blinding light that ripped through the empty void, slamming into one of the Xrithar warships. The impact shook the ship, a violent explosion that sent a shockwave rippling through the surrounding space. Halverson's ears rang, the echoes of the blast vibrating deep in his chest. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Thorne's voice broke through the haze. "We've got their attention. They're regrouping." Halverson's eyes narrowed as he saw the Xrithar ships shifting, their maneuvers growing tighter, their formation more coordinated. They were no longer attacking blindly. They were adapting. The realization hit him hard. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. "EMP pulse ready, Captain," Thorne said. "If we fire, it'll knock out their shields, but we only have one shot." Halverson stood still for a moment, the weight of their situation hanging heavily in the air. The sound of battle, the clashing of energy blasts, the sharp screech of impacted metal felt like the very heartbeat of the ship. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Halverson felt something else beneath the tension, something deeper. Earth's ingenuity had always been a silent weapon in the face of superior technology. They had been underestimated before, and now they had a chance to prove that Earth's true strength wasn't just in its might, but in its will to survive. "Fire the pulse," Halverson ordered, his voice unwavering. Thorne's hands flew across the display, sending the EMP pulse surging into the cold void of space. The instant it fired, a pulse of blue light exploded from the ship, sending a ripple through the surrounding area. The enemy ships staggered. For a brief moment, Halverson saw their shields flicker and then fail. The Xrithar's tactical systems began to glitch, their movements becoming erratic. "Captain, we've done everything we can," Lieutenant Kalen Thorne said, his voice quiet but with an edge of frustration. "But we're running out of options. Another wave of reinforcements is coming. If they hit us before we can regenerate our systems, we're finished." Halverson knew the reality. The ship's outer hull had taken so many hits, it felt like it could collapse at any second. Their power reserves were nearly exhausted, and though the EMP pulse had worked, disrupting the enemy's shields and briefly throwing them off course, it hadn't been enough to break them. Now the Xrithar Legion was regrouping, learning from their previous mistakes, and they were closing in. Every instinct told him they were running out of time, but in the back of his mind, something else kept pushing forward, a gut feeling that this was their moment. They had one shot left. He turned to Commander Ren Voss, who stood near the tactical station, his eyes scanning the incoming data on the laser plasma display. "Voss, any way we can take them off their game? One final move?" Voss's lips tightened, and for a moment Halverson could see the weight of the situation on his face. He didn't answer immediately, his mind racing, calculating options. Then, as the Xrithar ships on the screen shifted their positions, a flash of realization crossed Voss's face. "There might be a way," Voss said, his voice low but steady. "It's risky, but if we reroute the remaining power to the forward railguns and fire simultaneously with the remaining energy reserves, we can simulate a much larger burst. The enemy will think it's a full barrage. It might buy us enough time to initiate an escape maneuver. It won't stop them, but it'll make them hesitate." Halverson's gaze never left the screen, but he nodded slowly. "Make it happen, Voss." "Now." Voss didn't hesitate. His fingers danced over the console, pulling up the last of their available systems, rerouting power with a precision that was almost frightening. The rest of the crew was working in a tense mechanical silence. Even the air in the bridge seemed thick with concentration. Halverson knew they were on borrowed time. The dim red lights flickered once, casting brief shadows across the faces of the crew. The ship was nearing the breaking point, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. "Captain," Thorne said, his voice laced with urgency, "I've got them on a full trajectory to launch their main offensive. They're coming for us, and they're coming fast." Halverson's heart skipped a beat. The Xrithar Legion wasn't just throwing in their last wave. They were committing everything they had left to wipe them out in one final push. This was no longer just about surviving the battle. It was about outthinking the enemy, about showing them that humanity could adapt and survive, even when everything else had failed. "Get ready," Halverson said, his voice calm but with a hint of something darker beneath. "We do this now, or we die trying. No other option." The ship jolted again, and Halverson steadied himself, gripping the console harder. The laser plasma displays on the wall flickered as Voss worked quickly, inputting commands, recalculating their positions. Each second felt like a lifetime, and yet Halverson stood still, forcing himself to stay focused. The ship lurched violently as another salvo from the Xrithar fleet struck the hull. This time, the shields flickered weakly before collapsing entirely, and the comms crackled with static. In the distance, through the front viewport, Halverson could see the enemy ships drawing closer, their weapons primed, ready to end this. "Now!" Voss shouted, and the ship suddenly surged forward with an unexpected burst of power. The railguns fired, once, twice, each shot cracking the stillness of space with a violent explosion of energy. The Xrithar ships shuddered. They hesitated. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of Halverson's breath, slow and controlled. Had it worked? "Did it buy us enough time?" Halverson asked, his voice low, edged with tension. Voss's eyes darted to the heads-up display, his fingers moving like lightning across the console. Then, with a faint, reluctant smile, he said, "It did. They're pulling back for a moment, but it won't last. They'll come back with everything they've got. We've got minutes, maybe less." Halverson turned to Thorne. "Take us to maximum speed. Get us out of their range." "We don't have the power, Captain," Thorne replied, his voice strained. "Not for long enough. The engines won't hold much longer." Halverson exhaled, his mind racing. "Do whatever you can. We're not finished yet." As Thorne worked, Halverson's mind flashed back to the early days of the First Contact War. Earth had been knocked down, time and again, by the galaxy's superior forces. But in every defeat, humanity had learned, adapted, changed. Halverson could feel that lesson surging through his veins. "Commander," Halverson said sharply, turning back to Voss, "we're not just getting away. We're going to make them think we've abandoned the ship. We make it look like we've lost everything. That's when we hit them." Voss raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "We're using their arrogance against them," Halverson replied, the edge of a plan forming in his mind. "When they think we've finally broken, that's when we hit them with everything we've got. They're going to expect us to run, but instead we'll hit them with the full force of humanity's will. One final punch." Thorn gave him a long look, uncertainty flickering in his eyes, but Halverson saw something else too, something the rest of the crew had caught. It was a glimmer of belief, a flash of understanding that even in their darkest moment, they weren't defeated yet. With a few sharp commands, the crew moved into position, setting the trap. The Xrithar ships drew closer, their firepower primed. Halverson watched, every instinct telling him they had one shot left. His heart thundered in his chest as he gave the order to strike. The EMP pulse fired again, then the railguns, one after another. For a brief moment, the stars outside seemed to flicker, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The second the EMP pulse hit, the Xrithar fleet staggered, but only for a brief moment. A loud hiss echoed through the bridge as Thorn worked feverishly to adjust the ship's course. The Aurelia Hope swayed, twisting through space as the damaged thrusters fired at an unsteady pace. The ship was barely holding together, but in that fleeting moment, it had given them an opening, an edge, however small. Captain Darius Halverson stood, his gaze never leaving the laser plasma display, where the Xrithar ships were starting to recover, their weapons priming for another lethal strike. "Hold them back," Halverson said, his voice low, almost a murmur. He knew their time was running out, and his next move had to count. Thorn didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. His fingers flew over the console, rerouting the failing systems, pushing every last ounce of power into the ship's final defenses. The crew was focused, but Halverson could feel the tension tightening like a coil. The seconds stretched, thick and heavy. "EMP pulse recharge complete," Voss announced, his tone measured despite the chaos unfolding outside the bridge. "Another pulse ready to fire in 30 seconds. Halverson felt his chest tighten. They had one last chance, one fleeting moment to strike before the Xrithar closed in for the kill. "Get us into position," he said, voice hardening. "Thorn, prepare to fire when I give the word. Full charge on the railguns. We need to give them something they won't recover from." The heads-up display flickered, showing the enemy's ship movements, their patterns almost predatory. The Xrithar had regrouped, adjusted their tactics, and were coming in with a renewed ferocity. Halverson's mind raced, calculating every possible angle, every weakness they could exploit. The tension inside the bridge was suffocating, like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the wind to push them over. Lieutenant Thorn kept his eyes glued to his display, not once glancing up, his body still, but his mind working furiously. He was a machine in human form, his training sharp, and Halverson knew that without him they'd already be lost. "Captain," Thorn said, his voice calm, but with a trace of something beneath it. Anticipation, perhaps. "We've got the coordinates, ready to fire." "Not yet," Halverson replied, voice like steel. "Wait for it, just a little longer." The Xrithar were closing fast now. He could feel the ship rocking again, as if the entire vessel was bracing for impact. Another blast hit them. This time the ship lurched forward as the already damaged hull groaned under the strain. Halverson felt the shockwave ripple through the deck and into his bones. The sound of strained metal was like nails on a chalkboard, but the real threat wasn't the blast. It was the Xrithar's calculated movements. Suddenly, a piercing whine filled the bridge. "Shields failing!" Thorn's voice was sharp, tight with urgency. "We can't take much more of this." The crew had gone silent. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air, suffocating, but Halverson didn't let it faze him. He stood taller, watching the enemy's every move, every slight shift in formation. His hand was steady on the console, poised to deliver the final blow. "They're preparing for a direct assault," Voss said, his voice still calm. But the tension was there, unmistakable. "Captain, they're going for the kill." "Let them come," Halverson muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice didn't tremble. He was sure now. "When they strike, we make our move." And then it happened. The Xrithar ships suddenly surged forward, weapons primed and ready. In that single instant, Halverson knew the battle was about to reach its apex. They had taken the bait. Now, they had to strike. "Fire now, Thorn!" Halverson ordered, his voice booming through the chaos. "All railguns, full charge!" The bridge erupted in sound as the railguns fired simultaneously. The ship shook violently, the force of the blasts sending shock waves through the hull. The heads-up display showed the missiles leaving the ship, traveling through space with speed and precision, each one tearing through the void, heading directly toward the Xrithar fleet. The first impact was deafening. A pulse of white-hot energy erupted in space, tearing apart one of the leading Xrithar ships with brutal force. But Halverson wasn't looking at the explosion. He was already calculating the next move. They couldn't stop here. Not yet. "EMP pulse now!" Halverson shouted. Voss hit the button, and the EMP pulse fired once more, a wave of electromagnetic energy rippling outward. The Xrithar fleet shuddered as their systems overloaded, and for a moment the ships floated helplessly in space, unable to react. "Now, Thorn, finish it. Fire the last charge." Halverson's voice was razor-sharp, unwavering. His mind was focused, his thoughts clear. This was the moment. With a swift motion, Thorn slammed his hand down on the console, and the final railgun shot out. The impact was immediate. Another Xrithar cruiser was struck, its energy shield flickering briefly before collapsing entirely. The blast sent the enemy ship into a slow, spiraling descent into the cold abyss of space. "We've done it," Thorn said, his voice barely a whisper, though his eyes were wide with a mix of disbelief and relief. He had always known humanity had something the Xrithar couldn't predict, but now it was tangible. The victory, however brief, was theirs. Halverson didn't allow himself to breathe yet. The fight wasn't over. The Aurelia Hope was barely intact, and they still had a long way to go before they could rest. The remaining Xrithar ships were still a threat, and they weren't going down without a fight. But for now, they had managed to turn the tables. "Captain," Lieutenant Voss spoke up, his voice steady but with a note of caution. "There's still one left. They've retreated, but they're regrouping. They'll come at us with everything they've got." Halverson's eyes locked onto the laser plasma display. The enemy was regrouping, but this time they wouldn't be caught off guard. They had shown the Xrithar their strength, their willingness to do whatever it took to survive. But there was still a nagging sense of unease gnawing at him. The battle had turned, but Halverson knew the real fight was still ahead. He turned to the crew, his voice firm but calm. "Prepare for the next phase. They think we're weak. Let's prove them wrong." As the crew moved into position, the hum of the ship's damaged systems seemed like the calm before the storm. Outside, the darkness of space stretched infinitely, and Halverson could feel it. The growing weight of humanity's survival, pressing down on his shoulders. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. And when the Xrithar returned, they would be ready. The Aurelia Hope drifted, its once pristine hull now marred by the scars of battle. Captain Darius Halverson stood at the command console, his fingers hovering over the controls. His face was tight, strained by exhaustion and the weight of decisions made under duress. The ship's energy reserves were nearly depleted, and the crew was running on fumes. Yet, despite everything, there was no retreat in Halverson's heart. He could feel the momentum shifting, but he knew that the Xrithar Legion wouldn't back down. They would regroup, recalibrate, and come at them with even more firepower. "Captain," Lieutenant Kalen Thorn said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The last wave's pulling back. They're out of range for now, but their backup's on its way. Another cruiser, maybe more." Halverson's eyes flicked to the laser plasma display, where the Xrithar fleet's retreating movements were projected. The enemy ships seemed to hesitate, as if trying to gauge their next move. But Halverson knew it wasn't over. The fact that they had even managed to push the Xrithar this far, had turned their initial advantage against them, was a testament to the one thing they had always taken for granted: human adaptability. "We've got their attention, that's for sure," Halverson said, his voice steady. "Now we need to make them believe we're out of options. We make them think they've beaten us." Voss, the ever-calculated commander, stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "You're not suggesting a surrender, are you, Captain?" Halverson met his eyes, the question hanging between them. "No," he said, his voice hardening, "but we make it look like we have. We draw them in. Make them think we're desperate enough to run." Voss blinked in surprise, his hands coming to rest on the console. "You're going to bait them?" "Yes," Halverson answered. "We're going to make them think they've won, and then we'll hit them harder than they expect. We've got one shot at this." The plan was risky, dangerously so, but Halverson knew it was their only chance. The Xrithar Legion had calculated their every move, sure of their victory. Now, the question was whether they could convince the enemy that their final push was going to be their last. "How long until their reinforcements arrive?" Halverson asked, glancing at Thorn. 20 minutes, maybe less," Thorn replied. "They've sent a distress signal to their fleet. They'll be back in force, Captain." "Good. We'll use those minutes," Halverson said, tapping the console with renewed determination. "We have to make them think they're in control." The crew worked quickly, the tension on the bridge palpable as they prepped for the next phase of the plan. Halverson knew that every decision had consequences. Every mistake could be their last. As the crew set to work, he couldn't help but reflect on the past, on the countless battles humanity had fought, and the price they had paid for survival. There was no time for those thoughts now. "Voss, prepare to reroute power to the rear shields," Halverson said, his voice sharp. "We'll need a temporary defense to draw their fire. Make it look like we're weak, vulnerable." Voss didn't need more explanation. He understood what needed to be done. He began working, inputting the command into the ship's system, ensuring the power flow was redirected just enough to appear like a last-ditch attempt at survival. The laser plasma displays flickered briefly, their light dimming as the ship's system shifted, deliberately weakening the shields. "Thorn," Halverson continued, "set a course for the asteroid field, but don't make it obvious. We want them to think we're running. I want them to feel the victory in their grasp." Thorn met Halverson's gaze, and for a moment, the weight of the plan seemed to settle between them. It was a calculated gamble, but there was no other choice. They couldn't outrun the Xrithar, and they couldn't fight them head-on. The only way to survive was to make the enemy overestimate their position, to make them believe they were chasing down an easy target. "Understood, Captain," Thorn said. His fingers flew over the console as the ship slowly began to drift, the artificial gravity subtly shifting as they made their move toward the asteroid field, hiding among the drifting rocks and debris. The quiet hum of the laser plasma displays filled the bridge as the crew moved in synchrony, preparing for the next phase. The tension in the air thickened with each passing second. Halverson's eyes remained fixed on the display, watching as the Xrithar ships began to close the distance. Then a voice cut through the stillness. "Captain," Voss said, his voice low, "we've got something odd. One of their ships is moving ahead of the others. It's going to breach the asteroid field before we can properly conceal ourselves." Halverson's eyes flashed toward the heads-up display where the Xrithar ship's trajectory was being mapped. His mind raced. The plan was already dangerous enough, but this could ruin everything. "Thorn, accelerate. Get us into the field now," Halverson ordered, voice tight. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep this act up. One mistake, and they were done. The ship surged forward, the engines straining as they entered the asteroid field. The immense rocks, jagged and unpredictable, loomed like silent sentinels, their surfaces pocked with craters. The crew braced for impact, the slightest wrong move threatening to tear the ship apart. "Captain, they're still coming," Thorn said, his voice low, but with the edge of uncertainty. "They know we're here." Halverson's jaw clenched, but he kept his focus. "Stay the course. Wait for the signal." The ship navigated the dense field, weaving between massive asteroids, their colossal shadows swallowing the light from the distant stars. The silence of space seemed suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. Then, just as they reached the heart of the field, the signal came, the final, critical piece of the plan. "Now, Voss, detonate the decoys," Halverson commanded. Voss's hand hit the button, and immediately the EMP decoys hidden within the field activated. A burst of electromagnetic interference cascaded outward, overwhelming the Xrithar's sensors and temporarily scrambling their targeting systems. "Now, Thorn, full power to the forward railguns. This is it." The ship lurched forward, and in that single moment the crew unleashed everything they had left. The railguns fired, the blasts crackling through space with an intensity that could be felt even through the walls of the ship. The Xrithar ships, still reeling from the disruption, were caught off guard. One ship, then two, were struck, their shields failing under the sudden onslaught. "We've done it," Thorn shouted, his voice breaking with relief. "They're retreating!" But Halverson didn't let himself breathe yet. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Xrithar were retreating, but the momentary victory came at a cost. The Aurelia Hope was battered and barely operational, and they still had enemies to face. "Get us out of here," Halverson ordered, his voice steady, but the weight of the situation still pressing heavily on him. "We've bought some time. Let's make it count." The ship began to move, slowly at first, but as the heads-up display showed the Xrithar ships pulling back, Halverson allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. They had survived. This time. The Aurelia Hope drifted quietly in the aftermath of their narrow victory. The engines sputtered as they limped through space, their strength waning but still holding on. Every part of the ship seemed to echo with the strain of what had just happened. Captain Darius Halverson stood on the bridge, staring at the laser plasma display, his eyes locked on the position of the retreating Xrithar Legion. For a moment, there was a strange silence on the bridge, the usual chatter of the crew replaced by the harsh, metallic groan of the ship, still fighting to hold itself together. The battle wasn't over, but the turning point had come. For the first time, the Xrithar were questioning whether humanity could be wiped away as easily as they had once thought. "Status?" Halverson asked, his voice calm but heavy with the realization of what had just been accomplished. He wasn't sure if he was more exhausted or exhilarated, maybe both. Lieutenant Kalen Thorn glanced at the heads-up display one last time, his hands hovering over the controls, as if he didn't quite trust the data. "They're pulling back, Captain. They've regrouped, but they're hesitant now. I think we've made them think twice." Halverson nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the screen. He felt it in his gut. The weight of their survival. The knowledge that humanity had just shifted the balance in a way that no one could have anticipated. The Xrithar weren't retreating just out of tactics. They were withdrawing because humanity had shown them something they never expected. Strength through adaptation, resilience through resourcefulness. "We've turned the tide," Halverson muttered. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was something. "How much longer do we have before they return in full force?" Thorn hesitated, clearly assessing the situation. "Maybe an hour, maybe less. But we've taken their best shot. And we're still here." Halverson allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible exhale. For the first time in days, he felt the weight of the situation lift just slightly. But it didn't last long. The sense of urgency, the overwhelming pressure to continue this fight for humanity's future, pushed it away. "Voss?" Halverson called, turning to the commander. "What's the condition of the ship?" Voss stood at the tactical station, his brow furrowed as he analyzed the reports. His eyes were shadowed, the exhaustion on his face evident, but his tone never wavered. "We're barely holding it together, Captain. Hull breaches on multiple levels, life support fluctuating in the lower decks. We've got about 20% of our power left. If the Xrithar come back now—" "They will come back," Halverson interrupted, his voice unwavering. "And when they do, we need to make sure we can still fight. I don't care if we're limping. We can't let them think we're finished." There was a flicker of resolve in Voss's eyes, an acknowledgement of what Halverson was asking. The ship, like its crew, had been battered, bruised, and was barely hanging on. But there was no other option now. The message had been sent. Humanity would not go quietly into the cold void of space. A crackling noise came from the comms. "Captain!" came the voice of Dr. Ezekiel Barrow, his calm tone at odds with the panic of the situation. "We've managed to stabilize the patients here, but some of the diplomatic team are still in critical condition. We need to figure out what comes next. If the Xrithar come back..." Halverson didn't need to hear the rest. The weight of their responsibility was clear. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to protect the hope of peace, to show the galaxy that humanity was a force to be reckoned with, not through mindless violence, but through determination and negotiation.